I started doing catalogues of gestures, and I built what I call a Gestothèque. And that's the body of my work, where I interview artists and researchers and scientists, and I try to help them understand or make the idea of gesture as a boundary object, especially when you work in transdisciplinary field and you understand that saying the word gesture is different for everybody. So I try to help people define what is a gesture for them and understand also the chain of action they need to develop their practice. So that's basically my work, and I describe it through ethnography, and I tend to create catalogues of gestures.
Quite surprised, looking from the outside at the hand movements. But when I feel like I'm doing it, I feel like I'm doing something much more rigorous, but it's actually quite delicate. I would have thought I was using my whole hands, and I was using my fingertips a lot.
My name's Emma Woffenden, and I am a sculptor and make drawings, and I trained as a glassmaker from the age of 19. And have worked in most forms of glassmaking at different points, and set up quite comprehensive studios at times. I've worked with a gallery and in different contexts and design, and I'm based in London.
This is half a form, and it's symmetrical, and that's another thing which is relating very strongly to glass. So I work a lot, especially early on. I was working very symmetrically, or always trying to achieve some sort of symmetry in shape making, I guess. And that's, of course, again, a glass connection, because it's when you blow, you're always blowing something symmetrical, or you're trying to achieve symmetry to control the thing on the end of the blowing pipe. And that's what I did initially with glass, was I did a lot of glass blowing. And then all this work, this is a fiberglass mould, and it's taken from a modelled form, which was actually clay and polystyrene. And then I go on to take moulds from it and then slump glass over it. So with the two halves, it's quite it's like a column with a bud form on the top. And it relates quite directly to a smaller blown shape that I've worked with, and also with a hand shape. This is one half of a shape, and the mould it's the negative of the shape, and I'm painting in what will be the top layer of the positive shape. So it becomes three-dimensional once you put the two halves together. So if this was a resin fiberglass system, if I was boat building or making some huge outdoor sculpture, I'd be making it in resin and fiberglass, but I'm using gypsum-based product. And I'm putting the first layer, it could have lots of things in it, like colours or stone, ground up stone to emulate another type of material, but I'm just using it straight. And yeah, they call it a gel coat in industry.
When I chose to study glass making, it really was one of the first courses in the UK. And on that course, we were the first cohort to actually go through purely learning glass making. I went to the Royal College of Art in the early 90s, and I graduated with a very strong body of work which really shifted this aesthetics of the medium. And people in the early 90s really responded to this initial show, and although I wasn't that strongly aware of it, I was being offered and nurtured in different ways, and that included a relationship with the gallery.
This shape, yeah, it's got more than one reason. It comes from more than one place. So I've recently used it, these kind of shapes, like in almost like a puppet hand. So it's a simplified hand, and they come from puppets that I used to watch on TV as a child called the Wooden Tops. So I've used this form in a hand on a figure recently, but it also is a very early form I made in glass, but on a larger scale. So I would have originally made it in blown glass, but this time I made these moulds also to take other moulds from which I melt sheet glass over the top. These shapes and materials, they all exist and talk to each other and influence each other.
Factories that were closing down at the time, waterfalls, and British industry that was disappearing. It was 1981, between 1981 and 84. And it was an amazing privilege. And I also started to cast glass in those first years, and lost wax casting, and there was no knowledge at all. We literally were looking in ancient books from America, from Steuben, and making it up and experimenting. And across time, this medium became very accessible, and now there's a huge hobbyist market. Everything is compatible, everything is easy to work. But when we started studio glass making, moving in a sense, moving from industry into the artist studio, was still very young in the UK. It had its origins in the States, and of course it has an older origin in France with Gallet and Lalique, Argy Rousseau, people like that who had contact with that medium in the 19th century.
So when this first painted layer activates and goes hard, then I'd start building it up with the next layer. So I'm using the same stuff at the moment in the studio, in a rubber mould at the moment, and I've thrown in some fresh ordinary plaster just to make it go off a bit quicker, so I don't waste the materials either. When you make something with your hands, you don't necessarily. You might make a drawing and you might make a model and you might take it quite a long way, but even then, during that whole process, you might not really know what it is you're doing, and then you don't have it verbalized in your head, you don't necessarily see it, and that's something very interesting I find, and I think I knew that when I was really young, is that you could just make something in your hand and then you look at it and it's part of you. That's or it might be what you're really thinking or feeling, and you didn't really know it, and then it stands before you, so to speak. I think a gesture for me is it can be a very minute thing, which is something that immediately comes to mind. And I think again in the 90s, I became very interested in gesture. I was very interested in slow motion because you can really start to see these tiny movements, and I was very aware that in my work, especially blowing work, there was a lot of gesture and movement in the medium itself of blowing glass. Actually, there's a lot of movement. It became very important to me, I think, because I understood that somehow that's how we decipher people around us, and I was very, very interested in the body. And I think, I was able to distill. I was really interested in distilling gesture, the idea of relating it to the body in the sense, I had a sense of my body curling in and curling out. I was very interested in breathing, the idea of the breath. So I could see gesture in a very abstract way, that it could also be a sensation. And maybe gesture is a different connection. Maybe it's actually, you skip the thinking, you go straight to the hands, and the hand, what happens between the hand and the material. This stuff it's like a PVA, like a wood glue base probably. It's a secret recipe. And I'm weighing 2.5 to 1 in weight ratio. And I've been thinking about it recently, just those, as a 14-year-old, learning these few basic skills with ceramics, and you make a pebble pot, and then you make a little slab box. And then, that's just an amazing thing that you actually managed to form something in your hands. And then I remember very quickly afterwards having my first sort of idea or concept, and that was to try and make a ball, a coiled ball, and you can't see the base. So this was my obsession, that it looked like it was floating. And so I guess that was, the first it would have been the first time I was trying to make a sensation in a way, because I wanted that ball to look like it was ungrounded, and you couldn't see the base was what I was obsessed with. And it was a coil pot. So, I think in recent years I've been thinking a lot about that and worrying less about how things fit into art forms or time, and realizing that there's quite a basic reason and desire, and the desire is perhaps more important than the outcome. So I've been thinking about that a lot, and now I'm putting in the fiberglass, and there's a matting, and the matting is designed that it can stretch around into a three-dimensional shape, and the chopped strand, which is in the jar, is a reinforcing material. I think I've used this material more and more over the years because it's very stable, and it's something I can also, it's quite light, and it's something I can use with glass, so I can make part of a sculpture in this material and somehow fix it within or around the glass. And in a sense, it is glass itself. And it's actually, I always describe it, when you put it against glass, it's quite a dead material. If you had a whole sculpture made out of this material, I always have the sense it's not like a stone or a ceramic or a bronze even, that it's a bit close to a plastic in a way. And glass, when you put a little bit of glass anywhere near this stuff, actually the contrast is quite interesting. So I end up with quite a lot of glass form. So I take moulds off of glass, blown glass shapes, or cast glass shapes, and then remake them in another material. So I'm going back and forth all the time. Or initially I worked a lot with sort of styrofoam shapes, and styrofoam's quite a nice material to work with in relation to glass, because again it's very light, and it's also an inflated material. And then I'd reinforce that with car body filler, which is and then really work the surface. But it could take 6 weeks to make the model. If you when I first started out and I was making quite large scale objects and shapes, or you might make it roughly in clay and then take it into another material and then make it really hone it, so to speak, and then so there's a lot of moving around with that. And then once you have that shape, in the early days when I was then casting, I used to cast a lot, and taking that model, which had taken a long time to make, you'd then make it into wax, and then that wax needed to be made into glass, and that glass could be in the kiln for weeks and weeks. So after the mould making, and all these things over the years have become easier as the movement from industry back into the artist studio with glass as a material. That was quite young when I started, and now it's a lot of other companies and suppliers have grown up around it. A lot of studios have tried and tested, artist studios, so all those things have become easier. I quite like cutting this stuff to fit. It's a bit like layers of skin, something. Yeah, so you need to, and actually I find quite often people, they actually reduce some of these very long processes, so they'll sort of put it in one word, like it's just some simple skill, but there's so much technology and process that you need to, you really need to know about. And so this is one thing. But the refractory mould that came out of this was then put in a kiln, and glass was formed over it and then cut out, ground and glued together. There's this reductive thing that happens, and I always like to, when I'm on a panel or something, point this out, that the people sitting there, they're not just craftspeople, they actually run businesses, they got all these, they build their furnaces, they've got hugely scientific, really good knowledge, and you need to learn a lot just beyond trying to be an interesting artist. Or I grew up in a family where I was sort of the non-artistic and not practical one, and then I learnt a huge amount of practical skills. And I remember not being able to change a light bulb actually, and plugging an electric kettle in and lighting a gas under it. Things like really not very logical behaviour. I was quite young at the time, but I always feel you learn. It's just like any other form of practice. You practice it.
I was really miming hand movements. So rather than me taking this lump of glass to a spinning flatbed wheel, I was doing it by hand actually. Because I didn't mind the machine, and otherwise I'd have just stood there like this. So I decided to do things by hand. Lots of circular movement in glass, as in ceramics, really. And then also grinding materials to the glass, using other bits of glass. And then mixing, mould making, sprinkling plaster across the surface of water and waiting for it to be absorbed, and then finally stirring.